to another video on Crash Course Apologetics. This is the channel where I summarize the work of Christian scholars through animated videos and also now interviews. I've been doing interviews for a little while. I try to keep it somewhat balanced. So our guest today is Dr. Paul Copan. I'm super excited to have him on because I own many of his books, have read many of his books, and they're fantastic. I think he's the ultimate crash course apologist. Some of these books like God Goes to Starbucks or When God Goes to Starbucks, and That's Just Your Interpretation, and what was it? The couple other ones. How Do You Know You're Not Wrong? The one today is True for You, True for You.
But not for me.
But not for me, right. So all of them contain these pithy chapters on a variety of topics, and I can't encourage you highly enough to go and look at these books. I think if you do, especially if you're interested in apologetics, many of your questions will get answered. It's great. So I called the thumbnail True for You, but not for me. But what I want to talk about in particular is moral relativism and religious pluralism. So that's what we're going to do today. But first, before we jump into those, can you tell us just a little bit about your background, Paul?
Sure. I grew up in a Christian home, but it wasn't until high school that I started to see that the Christian faith made sense, that the pieces came together, not just existentially, heart matters, but also intellectually, seeing that the Christian faith had excellent objective foundations, that the resurrection really happened in history and so forth, and there are good supporting reasons for those sorts of things. So just led me into taking my faith seriously, and did an undergrad in biblical studies, did a Master of Divinity degree, and also a Master of Arts in Philosophy of Religion, which is what kind of got me going in the direction of apologetics and philosophy, and studied under William Lane Craig at Trinity Seminary, and then went on from there to after being on staff with the church for 6.5 years, went on to Marquette University to get my PhD in philosophy. My wife and 4 of our children at that time, and then our 5th one was born in Wisconsin, and then we're Zacharias International Ministries in Georgia, and then came down here to Palm Beach Atlantic University, where I've been since 2004.
Wow, that is a full list there. You've been a lot of places, done a lot of things, but that's awesome. Okay, so let's talk first about moral relativism. Okay, so explain to the viewers what we mean when we say moral relativism, and you can bring the concept of truth and knowledge in at this point if you'd like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, when we're talking about relativism, whether it relates to truth or morality, we're basically saying that something is true or right for one person or culture, but not another. You've heard the slogan, when in Rome, do as the Romans, suggests that they've got their cultural ways and you just kind of step in and adapt and so forth. And maybe what's considered immoral for one culture might be just fine for another. And so it has that sense of, there's no fundamental moral truth or standard or any truth at all when it comes to the issue of what's called epistemological, that there's no such thing as objective truth. Then you basically are dealing with something that is relative to, rather than objective or independently true of what I think or believe or what a culture thinks or believes. So it would have been wrong, for example, for Hitler to do what he did, even if everybody in the world came to side with the Nazis. That still would have been wrong. So even if everybody believes it, and it's immoral, then it's or if everyone believes that Hitler was right, even though that's immoral, it's still immoral. The majority doesn't win here. The culture doesn't win here. There are objective truths independent of culture, of human thought and construction.
Okay.
So we can talk. When we talk about truth, what we mean by truth is that something matches up, a belief, a story matches up or corresponds to the way things really are. So if I say the moon is made of cheese, it's false. Why? Because that doesn't match up with reality, doesn't match up, doesn't correspond with the way things really are. And so if something is knowledge, when we talk about knowledge, it's connected to the truth. It's you can't something unless it's true. So knowledge is warranted true belief. That is, it's got to be a belief. You got to believe it. It is something that is true, but you could believe something that's accidentally true. Like you look at a clock and it says 3 o'clock, and it's actually a stopped clock, but it happens to be right, dead on at 3 o'clock. You draw the conclusion that it's 3 o'clock, but it's based on faulty information. Is it a true belief? Yes, but there's something that turns true belief into knowledge, and that is what we can call warrant. And so that is what we talk about when we're dealing with knowledge. It's more than just accidentally true belief. It is something that is warranted true belief. So those are some of the parameters that we can talk about now that we are kind of in this groove, but we can refer back to these and you can clarify if you like, or seek clarification if you like. But that's kind of the lay of the land.
Okay. And so relativism can be applied in other areas. I focused in just on moral relativism, or at least we're going to focus on just the moral dimension, but it could be applied to other areas. You mentioned just epistemology in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, epistemology is the study of knowledge. For those who may not be familiar with that term, that's the study of knowledge. How do we come to know something? Can we know something, etc.?
So I imagine a relativist could, based on that definition you gave of knowledge, they could affirm the belief part. They have this belief, but the truth part, for the relativist, what is the truth maker of some belief? Like what to them would they say? Do you think they would say it corresponds to reality, or do they say it corresponds to what I think about reality? Like it's just another belief they have. Do you get my question?
Sure, it could be the truth maker, what makes something true, rather than it being reality making something true. It could simply be their preference. It could be sincerity. If you believe something sincerely, then it's true. It could be something that makes you feel good or whatever. It could be a range of things, but fundamentally, the relativists' truth amounts to nothing more than opinion, at least in certain selective areas, as we'll talk about. We'll note that the relativist can't be consistent across the board, that the relativist has to be selective about where his relativism goes and how far it goes and where it stops.
Okay. Yeah, that was a question as I reread the chapters. I wanted to be clear about what we typically mean by truth, and so that if you find yourself in conversation with someone offering very relativistic ideas, I think it could be helpful to clarify what they mean when they say something is true. What would be the truth maker of that? And I think you're probably right. A lot of times it will be something along the lines of sincerity, something like that. Okay. So before I ask you to maybe offer some constructive criticisms here. We're not necessarily trying to tear people down, but we want to look at this idea of relativism and see what its strengths are, maybe what its weaknesses are. Before doing that, though, do you think that moral relativism in particular is very prevalent right now? Because one of the questions I got from someone on Facebook was that this really a relevant topic, because it doesn't seem to this individual that moral relativism is widely held in common culture.
Yeah. Well, I'd suggest that maybe this person needs to get out a little bit more. And I would refer you to there's an excellent website, and I'm a subscriber to this. It's called the Gatestone Institute, and I think it's gatestoneinstitute.com or .org. But read about, say, multiculturalism in Europe and how fundamentally it's causing European cultures to disintegrate because there's nothing really holding them together anymore. How can we say that Islamic Islamists are wrong in what they believe, and who are we to say that their beliefs are wrong? We shouldn't say that anybody is superior. Or any culture has any aspect of superiority over anybody else. And so there's a reluctance to criticize. I mean, they'll criticize, again, here's the selectivity part. They'll criticize the Christian faith, but basically, as J.P. Moreland once said, there is, anything goes on university campuses, and fundamentally, the only heresy on university campuses today is Orthodox Christianity. So that's how things go. I was just at a discussion yesterday, and there was someone who had attended a conference at Yale University, and fundamentally they're talking about all sorts of sexual moral perversions as being kind of a pathway to the divine. So really, the more perverse you can get, the more you break from, say, traditional understandings of morality, the more you can experiment sexually and so forth. This is kind of a pathway to spirituality. So again, those are the types of things that are rather frightening. And this is going on in university campuses, and nobody wants to say anything about anybody else being wrong. Who am I to say that someone else is wrong? We don't want anybody to feel bad, right? And so if you or you video, I talk about the theme of true for you but not for me, and there's I mentioned somebody who's at the University of Washington campus who's interviewing a bunch of people, and he's like a 5'9" white male. And he says, what if I told you I was Chinese? What if I told you I was 6'4"? What if I told you I was a woman? What if I told you that I was 7 years old? Those sorts of things. And basically, none of the students, or very few of the students, wanted to push back and say, well, you're wrong, or you need to get some help, or something like that. No, they didn't want. It's very much an affirming or coddling culture that we find ourselves in. But once you go against them, once you disagree, then that's there's the heresy. So anyway, there you have it.
Okay, I think that's that video in particular you mentioned, I think is a good demonstration that relativism is alive and well, especially like you said on university campuses.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk then about maybe before we try to critique, what's an argument that people offer in support of moral relativism, or do they not offer an argument? What do you think?
Yeah. Oh yeah, you'll have sometimes a diversity argument where people will say, look, there's so many different beliefs around the world, different moral practices and so forth. Who are we to say that someone else is morally wrong, or that that's immoral? Or you might have kind of the historical argument where you say, well, yeah, people used to practice those things and they sincerely believed that they were right. And so basically it's the idea that we're kind of products of our own time. Who are we to say that we are wiser, better, that we are in the know? Who knows? Things could change later on. And so.
Oh, wait 1 second. Let me try. I'm going to end the call and try bringing you back. It's like I've lost you. Well, it says Paul is unavailable. while we're waiting to try and get him back, if you have a question for Dr. Copan, now would be a good time to type it in the live chat. The easiest way for me to see it is to type at the symbol and then the actual words, Crash Course Apologetics. Don't put at CCA or else I won't see it. Put at Crash Course Apologetics, and it highlights it for me so that I can find your question very quickly and easily. Let's see if I can get him back. It's still choppy. I don't see you yet.
There we go. Can we do that?
There we go. Yeah, I don't know what happened.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Just kind of froze.
Yeah, it froze for me too. But that's okay. I told our viewers now would be a good time to go ahead and type their questions into the live chat. So you can continue. You left off. You gave two reasons that someone could offer in support of moral relativism: the disagreement, and then that people have sincerely believed these things in the past that now we think are wrong, and we sincerely hold our beliefs. So who's to say that our sincerely held beliefs won't be wrong as well?
Right. Yeah, I mean, those are. I don't know if you wanted me to respond to those or.
Yeah. So now would be
your questioning.
Yeah, now would be a good time to, I guess, go ahead and we've laid out the view. We've offered a couple of reasons that people would give as evidence for the view or reason to think that view's true. Yeah. So how would you respond? Give me some criticisms here.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. One is that if you appeal to the idea of, well, people hold differing beliefs, one is to say, well, you may be confusing applications with principles. You can have common principles, like we may do differently when it comes to honoring our parents here in the United States than, say, one would in China. There may be different applications of a fundamental principle that undergirds them or underlies them. So to say that there are different practices doesn't necessarily undermine the reality of an undergirding principle that is being applied in different, but not necessarily inherently conflicting ways. There are different ways of applying it, and culturally attuned ways of applying it, and so forth. So that's one thing. Also, notice that those who are making this observation, they're saying, well, look, we could be wrong. Well, just because we could be wrong, it doesn't logically follow that we are wrong or that we shouldn't take any of our moral beliefs seriously. We have to ask the question, what reasons are there for rejecting certain fundamental truths, like torturing babies for fun is wrong? Are there really any objections to that? Do you really believe that, when it comes to the historical idea that things have changed, people used to believe things this way and they've changed and now they hold to different things? Well, do you really want to say something like, that before the civil rights movement or before the Civil War, that maybe, that blacks didn't have value or something like that? Do you really want to say that? So we need to ask the question, is it just because there's been legislation that things have changed that we assign value to people? Well, no, morality is not invented. It is discovered. And we don't have to deny that there can be historical development, a moral kind of awakening as we move along in history. But just because there's a certain moral awakening doesn't mean that that certain things weren't true. It's kind of like scientific discovery. Just because people didn't know about it doesn't mean that that certain fundamental structures of reality and in the natural world weren't in place, that they weren't relevant to how the universe functions. So just because there is this ongoing development of our own moral awareness that doesn't at all prove that somehow morality is just something that tumbles along in history and that there is no undergirding structure to it. Again, keep in mind the distinction between morality being invented versus morality being discovered. Now, people can also have hardened hearts. People may they may reject morality precisely because they want to do their own thing. They may reject morality because they have hardened hearts. And those who say that, well, maybe murder is okay after all, or maybe it's okay to torture babies for fun, or maybe it's okay to abuse your wife or something like that. Well, the atheist Kai Nielsen, even though he couldn't give good reasons for the basis of morality, he said anyone who thinks that is skeptical about wife beating, or these sorts of things. If anyone's skeptical about these things, that person hasn't probed deeply enough into the grounds for his own moral beliefs. So he said these are fundamentals. This is bedrock, and this is the correct way of thinking. And so again, it's something that's inescapable. There are certain things that are inescapable, and to deny them would mean to throw off the fundamental structures of our own humanity in order to accommodate the skepticism. And I'd say, no, you ought to go with what is, again, what's called the principle of credulity. You take something basic and fundamental like that to be true unless there are very strong reasons to overthrow that or to reject it. So again, it's sort of like sense perception. We take for granted the workings of our senses. We trust them. They typically are leading us in the right direction toward the truth. But it doesn't mean that we can't have an optical illusion that maybe if we're haven't gotten enough sleep, we might start seeing things or whatever. But it doesn't mean that we throw off the entirety of our own perceptual faculties just because we could possibly get some things wrong once in a while.
So you brought out a couple of helpful distinctions. You brought out the difference between I think it was presumption or and application. What was it?
Oh, the principle,
the
fundamental principle, and the application. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's one distinction, and I want to have you maybe offer an example of that. Go ahead now, if you don't mind. Can you give an example of maybe where two cultures had the same principle, but the way they applied that principle was different?
Well, I mean, I did mention Chinese versus Western culture and how honoring one's parents. There may be some cultures where keeping your promise might be laden with paperwork and so forth, and you sign and your signature is good. In another culture, it might just be, it used to be here too, you just shook hands and that was the deal. And so you can have various ways of we could even talk about maybe disciplining of children and so forth. There may be different ways of doing that in certain cultures, or even when it comes to your own children. For some, maybe corporal punishment would be, appropriate. Sometimes just speaking a word of rebuke, depending upon the child, might be suitable. Discipline is important. Discipline is necessary for children, but it may vary depending upon the child.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the other distinction you made was with, well, I'm trying to remember now. I should have written it down. You made a second distinction other than the principle and application. It may come back to me. But let me move to my next couple of questions, because I wanted to spend about 30 minutes on moral relativism, and we're coming close, so I wanted to get these in for sure. When I was reading Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, it's my goal to read through that in a year, so I've been trying to just chip away at it little by little. It's a great book, but they have a section on ethics, and so one of the critiques they offer of relativism is the reformer's dilemma. Mm-hmm. So what is the reformer's dilemma?
The reformer's dilemma basically states that all of these things that many humans take as moral gains, like the abolition of slavery or the abolition of widow burning in India or foot binding in China, or the achievement of, in the civil rights movement of equal rights in voting and so forth for blacks, etc. Those are considered moral gains. Those are considered moral improvements for a society. But if you're a relativist, no, there is no such thing as improvement. There is no better or worse. But yet this goes against our fundamental intuition that no, it was actually a good thing to set slaves free. And so, in fact, even when people appeal, I should add this on the historical front, when people say, oh, well, people used to accept slavery. Well, if you were a slave, you knew slavery was wrong. It wasn't as though, there were some people in power who said, yeah, slavery's okay. But again, it wasn't as though everybody just accepted it back then. So that's one thing we need to keep in mind. There's a lot of slavery today, too, we should add. But again, when it comes to the reformer's dilemma, these, like the abolition of apartheid in South Africa, that was a moral gain, a moral good. But if you're a relativist, there is no improved situation. There is no better or worse. It's just cultural. It's just individual perspective. It's just relative to you or your culture. So again, that leaves you in a problematic position. And also, even when relativists say there are no objective moral values, etc., often they will make these moral assertions like you can do whatever you want. But they'll often tack on a moral qualifier, just as long as you don't hurt anyone, just as long as it's between two consenting adults, etc. So they'll tack on these moral absolutes or objective duties to their relativism because they can't just let their relativism stand on its own.
Gotcha. Okay, so a couple more questions before I move to religious pluralism. One of them came from my wife, and I remember she and I had this discussion back when the event happened. I guess it might have been, it hasn't been more than a year, I don't think, but there was this guy that he wanted to reach this certain tribe that was unreached with the gospel. Mm-hmm. But there had already been people previously who tried to go there and had been, I think, killed already. And he knew before he went there that there was a really high chance he's going to be killed. Mm-hmm. And so he goes and he does get killed. And then there's this outcry, not against the people who killed him, but against him for trying to force his beliefs on this unreached people group who didn't want to be reached. They'd made it clear, like, we don't want outsiders. We just want to stay to ourselves. So I feel like relativists critique the missionary or missionary work and say that is wrong, and that's arrogant of you to think that your beliefs are superior to their beliefs and they have to convert because yours is better. So what would you say to this kind of charge against missionary work?
Well, a couple of things. One is, yes, in the, say, cultural anthropologists, there is kind of this assumption that it's immoral or wrong to do things that missionaries do. To do those types of things is seen as ethnocentric, colonialist, and so forth. But of course, those critiques themselves assume that it is morally wrong to impose your culture or your values on someone else. Of course, what does impose mean? I mean, presumably you're going to persuade people. People can freely accept or reject it. So again, there's a moral standard there's this moral absolute that is assumed here. That it is morally wrong to be ethnocentric, whatever culture you're in. So you've got a problem there. Where does that moral standard come from? One of the things that we could mention here too is that are there no improvements that perhaps have come to certain cultures thanks to the exposure to other cultures, literacy, reading, having a script that you can then have words. There's nothing. Yes, oral cultures may be wonderful, but there's also something to be said about education, public education, literacy, and so forth. And as missionaries have gone to different places, they have brought literacy to places. And in fact, I'm often talking about this sort of a thing. Robert Woodbury at Baylor University has documented the impact of Protestant missionaries throughout the world, and that they have brought literacy. They brought actually democracy to other cultures where they've been under oppression from colonial powers. They've actually been the buffer between them. You can also talk about how missionaries have, you basically spin the globe wherever you see. Wherever you see stable democracies, look for the stamp of Protestantism there. So anyway, there are a number of things that we could say about this, that perhaps there are some goods that come, that maybe people who are living without an understanding of the germ theory of disease could be benefited from those who come into their culture and help inoculate, those who are subject to various diseases and so forth. Is that not a good? So again, it just seems rather just this categorical dismissal of any sort of outside influence. We have to ask, well, could there be any goods that come? So rather than writing that off, we need to recognize that there could be some goods that come to that. Also, a third thing, and I'll stop with this, is that there may be people who live in fear and bondage, and that somebody who's in India, from India, someone I know of through a friend of mine from India, who this man used to sweep excrement on India's streets, and he assumed that he was doomed because of the way he lived in a previous life, and his grandfather had done this, his parents, his grandfather, etc. It's all part of this, untouchable caste, so to speak, untouchable group. But he heard a message about Jesus and how Jesus loved him and how Jesus came to give his life for him, so that there is a fundamental equality to all of us, that we're all equal before the cross. And he heard this message that so moved him, and he realized that he could find forgiveness, that karma didn't have to hang over his head. He ended up going to Oxford University to get his doctorate. His life had been so transformed by the gospel that he was able to break free from these chains of his own caste system. And he would say, he's still alive, but he says, because of Hinduism, I used to sweep sheet. But because of Jesus, I went to Oxford University. And so that is, I think, a powerful testimony that, just leave them alone. They like it the way that they are. People live in bondage to spirits. People live in bondage to all sorts of oppressive powers, to curses and so forth. And they need to hear, not that those powers don't exist, that those curses aren't real, but that Jesus is greater than they are, and that Jesus has conquered death. Jesus has conquered sin. Jesus has conquered curses, so that we can live in freedom and enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Just because that point's so interesting, I really appreciate that example. That's a really good, powerful example. Two other thoughts on this I'll run them by you. I know when I read Greg Koukl's Tactics book, he was explaining the tactic of I think it was called practical suicide or something like that. And what that is once you actually espouse an idea, it's self-defeating. So, and he gave this example, I think, of someone critiquing a missionary, and the dialogue went something like this. The professor says to this student who wants to do mission work, you really shouldn't try to go and tell other people that their most fundamental beliefs are somehow better than someone else's, and they need to change what they think about what's so deep. They so deep to the fabric of who they are. Tell them to change that, something so fundamental. That would be wrong. And the student says to the professor, well, my belief that I'm supposed to go and disciple these people, make disciples, is fundamental to me. That's fundamental to my structure. Are you trying to change that? And the professor's left like, well, I guess I am. And so in a sense, I feel like when someone critiques missionary work, they're basically doing missionary work for their own view. I don't know. Does that strike you that way, or did I overly simplify that?
Sure. Yeah, they're evangelists, so to speak, for their own positions. When it's I think I may have mentioned this in the book where someone I know was reporting about someone at work who was saying, "Don't pay attention to that Christian over there. That person's trying to share his faith with others and trying to convert you." And my friend said, "Well, aren't you trying to convert people to your view and away from that person's view?" I mean, so the same sort of thing is working. And again, it's not persuasion is, principled persuasion is permissible. People are made in the image of God. People can make judgments. People can think through the evidence and the reasons and so forth. The issue is which viewpoint is true. It's not as though one belief, the belief you've grown up with is sacrosanct. You may have grown up in a culture where there are terrible beliefs, dysfunctional beliefs. Again, all falsehoods and so forth. Well, just because you've grown up with it doesn't make that somehow privileged. It doesn't make it. Just because you've grown up with something doesn't make it wrong either. But we ought to we ought to be able to assess or make judgments based on other reasons than just simply I grew up with that or this is my culture. There may be someone has said in some cultures they love their neighbors, and other cultures they eat their neighbors. Which would you prefer? So again, these are the types of things that we need to be talking about as well. Again, like I said, cultures themselves may need reforming. They may need influences from the outside because they are corrupt, they are dark, and so on.
Okay. Here's what I'll do. I'll pause at this point. We've got a couple questions. Before I move to the topic of religious pluralism, for those that are watching, if you have a question specifically about moral relativism, go ahead and ask it at this point before we change topics. Because once we change, I just want to kind of stick on that topic until the end of the program. So there were a couple of questions that people wrote in. Someone by his YouTube channel name is One Bright Mind. He said, "How does the objective moral realist settle moral disagreements? My philosophy professor made a big issue about moral disagreements being like different tastes in music and unresolvable differences." Yeah.
Well, it's unfortunate that you go in the direction of tastes in say music or whatever. I think that what we need to do is focus on the clear and move to the unclear. If you begin with the murky areas, then you will, I think, fall into perhaps a pit of skepticism about moral beliefs. I think you begin with things like torturing babies for fun is wrong, or adultery is wrong, or those sorts of things. And then you work to the murkier areas. But again, some of those fundamental constraints at the extreme, or those fundamental extremes, remind us that that's where we ought to begin, where it's clear. The lexicographer Samuel Johnson said, "The existence of twilight is not a good argument against the difference between day and night." And so we need to remember that there are clear differences and that there are some disputes that are going to be debated. And what we do is we keep on going back to those fundamental principles of moral clarity that will help us inform us as we move to some of these issues regarding moral disputes. So again, the fundamental dignity and equality of human beings, that is a starting point for the moral discussion. Keep in mind too that there may be different worldviews that shape one's own moral thinking. There may be a Peter Singer, utilitarian type, who thinks that there may be that certain animals have greater value because of their utility than human beings do. So you can have so again, if you're dealing with that sort of a worldview, then you've got to push back further and say this isn't just simply a moral dispute, it's a worldview dispute. And then the question becomes, how do we address the worldview issues? Are there good reasons for thinking that there is a God who exists and who made human beings with dignity and worth? Or are we simply the products of these blind deterministic forces over which we have no control? Is that our starting point? Where do we get value in that case from valueless processes? Where do we get rationality from non-rational processes and so forth? So that's, I think, where we would go in order to resolve some of those other issues that, so just to look at can we resolve this equally rational minds and so forth. I understand that, the whole issue of peer disagreement and so on. But on the other hand, some of our backgrounds, some of the things that we privilege over other things will also be informative in this discussion too. Some people will see maybe a certain experience of evil as being non-negotiable, that this is kind of a starting point through which everything else is filtered. Well, if that's the stance that one takes, it may be difficult to get a certain, for that person to give a hearing to another point of view. So there may be certain entrenched viewpoints, and we just acknowledge that there's certain realities here. But I think it's helpful to go back to some of these worldview issues and then begin to disentangle things at that level before moving into the specific moral disputes.
Very good. All right. I'm going to go ahead, in the interest of time, since we're at 40 minutes, move on to religious pluralism. And a couple people have written in other questions, but they're not on topic, so I'll just save those for the end. But go ahead and explain what religious particularism is in contrast with religious pluralism.
Okay. Yeah, a particularist would take the view that, say, the Christian faith is true, or the Muslim faith, and where other viewpoints would disagree with it, then they would at that point be false. So it doesn't mean that if one viewpoint is true, then everything else that other viewpoints believe are 100% false. That's silly. But it does mean where they do conflict, then the particular viewpoint, the particular religion, is true, and the others at that point would be false, where they conflict with it. Now, the pluralist will say all religions are equally capable of saving or liberating. That John Hick, for example, who was a noted philosopher of religion, died a number of years ago, like 2012, I believe. But he maintained that all religions are not, for one thing, saying the same thing. They are saying distinct things, and you can't say they're all basically saying the same fundamental things. They disagree in fundamental points. But he also said that all of these religions, despite their being culturally conditioned attempts to get at this ultimate reality, he says they are fundamentally capable of bringing salvation or liberation, and that moral saints in various religious traditions, like the Dalai Lama in Buddhism or Jesus in the Christian tradition, that the fact that moral fruits are being born from their lives is an indication that salvation or liberation is taking place within those particular religious traditions. So religions are culturally conditioned, and so in a sense there's a falsehood associated with religion, and that they're culturally conditioned. But on the other hand, they are true in the sense that they are being directed toward this ultimate reality, toward what some will call God or Brahman or Lut or something like that. So that's an overview of particularism and pluralism.
Very good. And you even hinted, because my next question, after clarifying what we mean, was going to be what are some of the arguments that are offered in favor of religious pluralism. And you already mentioned this idea that there's these saints from various other religions, and that should we should be very hesitant to say they're somehow, I guess, going to end up in hell, or they won't be saved, even though they're such a good person. And so surely they took a different path than maybe us, but both of our paths end up working in the end. That would be one argument. That seemed like what John Hick, one line of argument that he offers.
Right.
But what are some others, or if you want to elaborate on that one?
Yeah, no, that's fine. We can go into, offer a response to that eventually. But another one is too that if you grow up, the pluralist might say, do you mean to tell me that if you grew up in this, in a tradition that isn't your particular one, that those people are inevitably lost? I mean, that there's that question of the unevangelized that often goes along with this, that it seems contrary to divine goodness. It seems contrary to justice to say that people are inevitably condemned because they haven't heard of Jesus or something like that. So you can have that sort of an argument. And also there's a certain presumed arrogance that pluralists like John Hick and Joseph Runzo have challenged particularists like Christians with. And it's basically, the Christian seems to have insider information that other people don't have. You've got the inside scoop on salvation, and the rest of us are benighted. We are left out of. It's sort of like this Gnostic illumination. You have access, insider access that nobody else can know about, and so and so you have a virtue that other people don't have. What makes you so special? Are you morally superior? Are you intellectually superior, or something like that? And so those are some other arguments that will go along with the pluralistic package.
Perfect. Okay, so let's respond then to this saints and other religions argument. There's these good people, and surely they're not going to end up condemned for eternity just because they were born in the wrong place at the wrong time. They're still such a good person. Surely it'll work out for them in the end.
Right. Yeah, and I would argue that no one is born at the wrong place or at the wrong time. The question is, what do people do with the light that they do have? What do people do with the revelation that God has given to them? If Paul is correct in Acts 17, where, yes, I do affirm he is, when he says that God is commanding all people everywhere to repent, he's not just saying that God is commanding the elect to repent. This is, all without exception, not merely all without distinction. And so Paul is saying that God, who is commanding repentance, presumably would give sufficient prevenient grace, kind of a grace that goes before salvation, that he would make that available to all people, wherever they happen to be born, that God makes this available to them. Now, do people appropriate this? Romans is somewhat pessimistic about this, but the point is that God makes his provision available to people, but many of them end up rejecting that kind of a provision. So again, that's something to keep in mind. When it comes to people's sincerity, well, the question is, what comes first? Is it sincerity, or is it the grace of God? Is the sincerity that is there actually a manifestation of the grace of God, or is this something that's independent of the grace of God, and therefore God is somehow obligated to step it up and do something about that sincerity that's there? Well, again, that's like a salvation by works sort of scenario. It basically reverses the process of things here. God is the one who is at work in people's hearts and produces that sincerity. And so if there is genuine sincerity, that people are truly lovers of the light and lovers of the truth, then that sincerity is an indication of God's grace already at work in that person's life. I would also mention this as well, that people are not cut off from salvation simply because they haven't heard of Jesus. And I think that that is an important element that some people say, oh, you're saying because he hasn't heard of Jesus, he's therefore automatically condemned. No, that's not what we're saying. What cuts a person off from salvation is saying no to God. As C.S. Lewis said, in the end, there are two kinds of people: those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done. And I think that that's fundamentally the way that we need to look at this issue. So again, those are a few thoughts on the whole sincerity, unevangelized question, but I don't know if you want to follow up with something else on that.
Yeah. So I've heard, for example, William Lane Craig offer Old Testament saints as an example of people who responded positively to God's offer for forgiveness, but they didn't have knowledge of Christ.
Right.
Do you think that, and that seems to be that kind of positive response to the light that they do have, and so I guess, yeah, your point is they respond, God's looking for how you respond to the light that you do have, not the light that you don't have.
Yeah, right, yeah. I mean, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was going to ask, post-cross, and I guess I know in your book you lay out several views that people take, but you can elaborate on those if you want, or just offer yours. I think you're a Molinist. I'm a Molinist. I go that route. But after Jesus has died and risen, and now the message has gone out, do you think there are people like a Melchizedek or like a Job who didn't have explicit knowledge of Christ but were nonetheless saved?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I know that what's called the inclusivist view would say, yes, there are plenty of people who are in that position. I would argue that that when it comes to the uniqueness of Christ, the importance of the gospel proclamation, that things, I mean, I'm open to God obviously doing whatever he wants, configuring things in such a way that he makes provision, just like he did in the Old Testament, that there might be some people who are, in a sense, even though they're epistemologically removed from the gospel, that is, they haven't believed in Jesus, they haven't known or heard of him, but if they cast themselves upon God's mercy, if they acknowledge their own sin and so forth, then they would be, in a sense, the equivalent to some of those Old Testament saints who also cast themselves upon God's mercy and found salvation on the basis of what Jesus Christ would do. And I guess we are left with is a certain question, and Bill Craig is one who notes that it's logically possible that this view is true, that God configures the world in such a way that those who would want to hear the gospel end up hearing it, and that no one who would want to hear and respond to the gospel is cut off from it. So God, knowing how people will freely choose in the possible worlds in which they are placed, God, knowing all of these things, would place people in a position where they would hear the good news of Jesus and thus respond to it. So I'm certainly, I promote that sort of a view. I'm saying that makes a lot of sense of the data of Scripture. But again, we need to remember too that God is able to do work in unique ways. At the end of the book of Amos, in Amos 9, God is saying that he's not only at work in the history of Israel, but also in with working with the Philistines and other people groups. That God is somehow at work in history in ways may not even be aware, and that God's purposes are not just for the chosen people of Israel, but also there's a broader purpose that God has in mind. Also, keep in mind that there are God is one who is revealing himself to, say, Muslims and other people groups or other religious groups through dreams. I'd say predominantly within Islam. I've met a number of former Muslims who had visions of Jesus and ended up becoming believers as a result of it, even though they didn't know anything about Jesus in the culture in which they had grown up. So God is able to reach people beyond where a missionary goes. So God is able to speak to people's hearts and communicate to them. And again, knowing how they would respond communicates the message even without a missionary or a preacher.
Mm-hmm.
So those are a few considerations.
Okay, very good. Let me follow up with one more point on the problem of the unevangelized, and then I want to return to the saints question, saints and others' religion. So we're talking about people that, based on the light that they do have, fling themselves on the mercy of God. They choose to they recognize their guilt, and they trust that God is going to work out some way to forgive them, and they seek to live a life of obedience to Him. What would you say to people that say, well, you can do that from within the context of Islam? Like if you commit to Allah that you're trusting in your salvation for Him to save you, and what would be the problem with that? You would say?
Well, I mean, I think it fundamentally comes down to certain competing truth claims that not all of them can be true. And that again, if there is this genuine sincerity that we're talking about, then it's not going to lead to Islam. It's going to lead away from Islam. It's going to lead to the one true God as revealed in Jesus. And so I would say that there can be maybe a preliminary appreciation of God's transcendence and so forth, having grown up in Islam, and a lot of former Muslims mention that they have an appreciation for Islam for that very reason. But on the other hand, they could not come to they could not come to God as their own Father, that the intimacy there was missing in Islam and so forth. So again, I would put it back to the whole sincerity discussion that we had, that these are the sorts of that we would be leading, that the truth away from Allah as understood in Islam. I mean, Christians Arabic-speaking Christians also use the term Allah for the triune God. So there's a theological versus linguistic issue here, but I would say that I'd go back to that point about the sincerity issue. But if you want to follow up on that, we can offer further clarity. If I fully address it.
It seems to me that to go the particularist route, I feel like, I could be wrong about this, I'm certainly open for your critique. It seems like at some point if you're going to affirm particularism, you're going to have to say that the content of what the person believes matters. That their beliefs can't just be anything, that they need to hold certain beliefs. And so it seems to me that they can hold any belief, but as long as you sprinkle sincerity on it, it's enough. That's not going to cut it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So the reason I think I tend to favor the Molinist route is that we can say the way that you can get to the content of the belief being true. It's not that all the beliefs have to be true. It's just that this kind of core, maybe something like, well, it doesn't even have to be the Apostles' Creed, but this very foundational understanding needs to be there. The way that you can get to that through, I think, without violating their freedom and without opening yourself up to sincerity is good enough, would be something like middle knowledge. Yeah. That's the impression I get.
I think the middle knowledge idea that we've talked about, God knowing these possible worlds in which certain humans are placed, configures the world in such a way that not only is salvation made available to them through the gospel, but there's also content that goes along with that. So yeah, I think that resolves a lot of issues. So anyway, I would concur with that.
Okay. All right, so let's return real quick to the saints question and like offer someone like Gandhi. Gandhi's usually held up as a very like an exemplar of what goodness in humans looks like. So if somebody challenged you and said, well, Dr. Copan, where's Gandhi today? Like, where is he right now? And obviously they would be implying you think he's in hell or something like that. What would you say? Like, would you say there really are these morally upstanding people, or would you say we're all sinners, or how would you go about responding?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I'd pick Gandhi as the upstanding moral example. I think there are some areas in which he's morally and theologically, intellectually compromised. But I won't go that route. There's a lot of, you can dig in the literature and find stuff on Gandhi, and so I won't go into to details here. But let's just maybe take someone who perhaps is more along the lines of, say, the Dalai Lama. I think who has a fairly good reputation and seen as kind and compassionate and so forth. It is interesting that even with the Dalai Lama, you have a problem in what he says, namely that in some of his lesser known writings or comments, he does maintain that one can only find true liberation or salvation through Tibetan Buddhism. That one cannot find it in by any other pathway or avenue. So you do have a certain narrowness that a lot of people accuse the Christian faith of having, and therefore dismissing it as somehow intolerant and so forth. Whereas this seemingly tolerant Buddhist has maintained, as on record, as saying that it's only really through Tibetan Buddhism that true enlightenment, salvation, liberation can come, and not through any. And he does admit that the Christian maintains that there is a creator. The Buddhist rejects that idea as fundamental, and he says both cannot be right. So it's good to also be clear about the person of whom we're speaking in terms of his own viewpoint about the narrowness of his beliefs and so forth. So it does put us in a similar kind of situation. That the person who says the Christian believes he has a virtue that other people don't have, well, here's the Buddhist who is doing the same sort of thing, who believes he has a virtue that Christians don't have. Mm-hmm. And so fundamentally, the pluralist who says you Christians are arrogant because you believe one way and that this is the only way, that's arrogant. Well, the pluralist believes that he is right and he has a virtue that the Christian doesn't have. So fundamentally, we're dealing with the same sort of a logical approach to it. The question is which viewpoint is the correct one. And I would say, as Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 2, he says, the Lord knows those who are his. If there is something that is unjust about the outcome of the Dalai Lama being separated from God, he does reject the Creator. If somehow God is going to work it out differently than what seems to be, in Scripture, if there is some sort of injustice here, in how I understand it, well, God is going to ensure that cosmic justice will be done. There will be no injustice in him. And so I would say that those who separate themselves from God, they condemn themselves. They are, and again, it's not a matter of our own performance that gets us into right standing before God. We've all failed, and the question is, now what do we do that we failed? We need divine grace. We need something to step into the gap, as it were, between our own failure and the moral ideal from which we've fallen short. And that is why the gospel message of Jesus Christ is so powerful and important, that only through that can that gap be bridged, the moral gap between our performance and the moral ideal. Where do we find forgiveness? Where do we find guilt, relief from guilt and so forth? It's through the cross of Jesus Christ. So when people turn away from those sorts of resources, when they turn away from the God on whom they should be casting themselves for mercy and so forth, well, I think there's the picture presented in the scriptures that people condemn themselves. People separate themselves from God. People resist the grace of God. People are saying no to God, and God makes repentance available to people, but people resist those sorts of influences. Mm-hmm. So I'd say that it's fundamentally not because God is sending people who would otherwise want to be in heaven to hell, but rather people condemn themselves. People separate themselves. Anyone who is, there's no one in hell who would want to be in the presence of God. All are justly condemned because they don't want God ruling their lives.
That opens a whole can of worms that because I would love to talk to you about I guess the problem of hell in particular maybe another time. But
you'll have to read the second edition of my book, Loving Wisdom, where I talk about that. So that's coming out.
That is one that I don't have. I don't have even the first edition.
The second edition is coming out, so that's no one has that.
Okay, well maybe when that comes out, I'll bring you back on if you want. But I do own most of your books. I feel like I have quite the collection. So, all right. Before I end up closing out the topic of religious pluralism and opening up Q&A, you mentioned this point. I just want to really just emphasize what it was. So you responded to the two arguments that are commonly offered, this kind of saints in other religions and the problem of the unevangelized. You responded to those. And then just now you mentioned that pluralism actually ends up having this same exclusivist problem that they accuse others of, because the vast majority of the world are religious particularists. They think where another's views are in conflict with their own, the other person's wrong. And the pluralist is doing the same thing. When we get to this point in the discussion where we say, are there many roads to salvation or only one? And there's disagreement there. The pluralist wants to say, you're wrong. That way that you're espousing is not correct. My way is correct. And that seems very exclusivistic, just as much so as the religious particularist.
Right.
Okay, well, there were a couple other questions I was going to ask maybe about... I might, if you're okay to ask maybe one more on this, and then
I should probably start getting to the Q&A time soon.
Okay, well, I'll skip that one and jump to the Q&A. That's fine. Yeah. Okay, so we've got just really, I think, a couple of questions. So, Darwin's Greatest Hits, that's what this YouTube name is, asked, are you familiar with Jeremy Koons's argument against divine command theory? If so, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I have not read Jeremy Koons on this, so I wouldn't be familiar with it. I mean, you can take a look. I do, Matt Flanagan, who's really good on divine command theory, he would know. But he and I worked on the book together, Did God Really Command Genocide? And we go into a lot of detail on divine command theory and deal with a number of issues, really kind of the whole range of objections related to divine command theory. But if you'd like to send a quick follow-up note to address that or to give a little clarity, that'd be fine. But I wouldn't be able to offer an informed opinion here.
Perfect. That's very humble of you. I'm glad you don't try to shoot from the hip. That's smart. Mm-hmm. I will tell Darwin's Greatest Hits this. I'm going to have Matt Flanagan on January 26th. Okay. And we're specifically going to be talking about divine command theory. So this would be a great time to raise that question if you're watching. Aiden Peterson asked, hey man, this is way off topic, so don't worry if you can't get to it. Dr. Copan how do you think Christians should think about climate change from a theological and ethical standpoint?
Yeah. Theological and ethical. Well, I would probably direct you to, there are a couple of different viewpoints on this that are found within the Zondervan Dictionary of Christianity and Science. So we took two views on this whole issue of climate change. I mean, I think there are indications that there is a warming trend, although I think it can be overblown. And also, I suppose the question is, is it, anthropogenic? Are human beings responsible for that? And the attendant question, if they are, what should be done to correct that? And I think that one of the persons who is offering a response to it deals with questions like, well, have we properly diagnosed what the cause is? And he also says one factor that is not typically taken into account is H2O, water, as being significant in the whole climate issue. And so he goes and talks about some of those things. So I'd refer you to that. And he also talks about the matter of stewardship, that overhauling entire economies in the face of massive climate change would unduly, burden economies. You think of India and so forth, where yes, you want to work toward changes that will reduce emissions and make conditions more livable and so forth, but to drastically shift things in such a way that people are taken off of a petroleum-based economy where the entire infrastructure requires that sort of a thing, and you want to move toward, solar and wind and so forth. You still, you need to do this sort of a thing incrementally. And again, I'm all for that. But it needs to be done incrementally, because otherwise I think we'll be crippling a lot of people, impoverishing a lot of people, and harming a lot of people by radical restructuring of economies and governments basically running things when governments actually don't do a very good job of that sort of a thing. So again, I would just refer you to the Dictionary of Christianity and Science and look at both essays. Both are well written. And you'll see some overlap there, but also some different approaches to what is to be done in light of this. I think sometimes there can be some alarmist declarations, and we're not going to be around in 10 years to talk about this sort of a scenario. Whereas I think we need to take concrete steps, kind of a multifaceted or multi-pronged approach to addressing these issues. But I think sometimes they can be overblown. And again, the question is, are human beings at the heart of it all?
Okay, very good. There's a person that wrote two questions. I think I'm saying the first name right, Svenska. Svenska, your second question was about the Euthyphro dilemma. Mm-hmm. And I was wanting, after we got off, to ask Dr. Copan real fast about the Euthyphro. But here's what I'll tell you, Svenska. I'm bringing on David Baggett to answer the Euthyphro dilemma on January the 11th. So I'll skip that question for now, because we're going to address
let me just give I'll just give a quick preliminary, and David will do a great job on it. But fundamentally, the Euthyphro dilemma isn't a dilemma. Does God do something? Does God command something because there's some sort of a standard independent of him? Or does God command something and that becomes the standard in an arbitrary sort of way? There is no dilemma, because fundamentally God is the standard himself. And what he issues, the commands that he issues, are rooted in his good and just character. So what people call a dilemma is not really a dilemma. It's just the solution is not something that atheists like, and so they'll appeal to the Euthyphro dilemma. But I'll let David Baggett take care of it. But I do touch on it in my book, Loving Wisdom, as well.
Great. I'm going to need this book.
Yeah.
Okay. I need to get my hands on it. So
yeah. Again, wait till April. Because that's, it's much expanded, goes into a lot more detail. Instead of 21 chapters, it's 32 chapters, and has an index and all that stuff. So it's much more, a lot more material to dig into.
Excellent. Okay. Svenska's first question, and this will be the last one we do, and we'll end here, was she said, some people try to counter theistic morals with the trolley problem. How do you counter those?
Yeah. Trolley, I say unto you. These are, again, the question is, the switchman at the, you've got a certain number of people on the tracks here, and, you could also, it's configured in different ways, or do you have a fat man? Or whatever, a woman, who could perhaps rescue a bunch of lives? Do you sacrifice that person to rescue these lives? Again, or do you calculate? Okay, if we are going down these tracks and there are 5 there, should I switch? And so you're calculating based on certain configurations, what's going to create the most amount of damage, what's going to cause the most amount of harm, and so forth. No, I wouldn't throw the person who is perhaps heftier onto the tracks to help stop the train and avert disaster. What you don't surrender an innocent human life in order to save others. I mean, you could argue that way. Again, it's a very utilitarian sort of argument. You could go on and say, well, if you want to save a lot of lives, why not maybe find a homeless person who is, maybe a perfectly healthy specimen, who, and they're these maybe Nobel Prize laureates who could really do a lot of good for humanity, but they've got certain diseases, or they need a new heart or lung or whatever. And what you can do is just take that person who just seems to be going nowhere in life, harvest that person's body parts, and save lots of lives and bring all sorts of goods to humanity. Once you go down that route, you end up doing all sorts of damage to the fundamental things that we have in terms of commitments to one another, family relationships. You can throw in Paul Gauguin, the painter, who left his family, went to Tahiti, painted women and tropical scenes and so forth. And a lot of people, if you want to use that utilitarian kind of argument, look at the kind of good that this would do a lot of people. You could say, well, it's too bad about his family, but look at the great good that he brought to the world with his paintings and so forth. What you end up doing is you fundamentally start to undercut those basic commitments with regard to our care for one another as human beings, our care for one another in our own families and so forth. You remove all of that and it simply becomes a utilitarian calculus, and we ought to stay away from that sort of a thing. What could this person do for society? If that person doesn't do as much for society, then that other person, well, then we have certain freedoms to take that person's life or harvest his organs or whatever, and break commitments, in other scenarios. So those are a few things to consider if you're interested in taking a look. I touch on some of these things in my biblical ethics book.
And Svenska, I'll also say, in True for You But Not for Me, the chapter called Good Without God, I think the first part, Paul goes through, I think, 10 problems with utilitarianism. He mentioned several right there, but there's also the on utilitarianism, motivations don't matter, only the ends do. And there were a couple more that you mentioned supererogatory acts, but I would go to that and look as well. So, all right. Well, I hope that you enjoyed it. I'm very appreciative of Dr. Copan spending an hour and 20 minutes with us. So thank you. And if you will stick around, Paul, just for like 1 minute after we get off, I'll end the program first. So thanks to everyone. I have several interviews lined up during the month of December. I have John Peckham coming on next week, talking about The Odyssey of Love. That was a fantastic book, super insightful. You wrote an endorsement for it, I remember. And then I have Tim Stratton coming on after him to talk about Molinism and the problem of evil. And then I am essentially putting on a conference for moral apologetics. I'm going to have Terrence Cuneo, David Baggett, Matthew Flanagan, and we'll see who else I can get. But I'm looking at the relationship between God and morality very closely and in depth. So I hope you join us. Lots to look forward to. Hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.